Hi and welcome to another episode of the Leadership Enigma. Can you believe it is now episode 53? Now, reflection time. I've said this before, that when you press the pause button on a computer, it stops. But when you press the pause button on a human, that's when we start to think. And the pandemic has given us 15 to 18 months of really thinking and reflecting deeply on who we are, what we want to do, in fact, what makes us happy. So this is an incredibly timely episode that we're going to call Being Before Doing. So come back to me in just a moment where we'll be talking to the wonderful Deborah Rowland.
You're listening to the Leadership Enigma, powered by Transform Performance International, a podcast for the insatiably curious to explore the power of human-centered leadership to create real momentum for positive and sustainable change. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts, and disruptors as we discover that success leaves clues. Now, here's your host, Adam Pacifico.
Deborah Rowland, welcome to the Leadership Enigma. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. I'm dialing in from sunny Cornwall, and life is good down here.
It looks great. Certainly, I can't see the sea. I know the sea is only about 100 yards from you, so I'm mildly jealous. You'll have to forgive me. Now, it's wonderful to have you on the show. We've spoken a couple of times. I've been looking forward to this particular episode. I know you're an author, an executive, a consultant, and a speaker, and you've really locked in and specialized in the leadership of change. So it's quite wonderful that you're now on the Leadership Enigma because, boy, oh boy, we seem to be living, leading and deciding in the delta of change at the moment. So how have you found the last 15 to 18 months on a personal level?
Oh, thanks for asking. Well, on a personal level, I feel quite blessed. I do have this home in Cornwall, and if there is a great place to self-isolate, it's certainly been down here. And as I'm also an introvert, which I've already shared, I think, Adam. Yep. And I know that some extroverts have been climbing up the wall, during lockdown. Whereas for me, it's wonderful. I can do these Zoom meetings and I can just don't leave meeting at the end. Don't have to do the social chit chat beforehand or afterwards. So, no, I think the things I've really missed though are my family, and unable to see my elderly father and brothers. So that's been the sadness behind it. But and I think it's just been a chance for me to reach out, to really understand the world a bit better, to be honest with you. So I've that's been one of the blessings, although it's created much hardship, I know.
Yeah, and I hope you get to see family members soon. And that's really poignant for this episode of Being Before Doing. I just want to come back to something, because we did talk, didn't we, about the introvert versus the extrovert, and the debate is who has struggled more. And you said you found certainly some benefits to being an introvert during this crisis. What have you found that you've changed over the last 15 to 18 months? Because you were you were doing loads of speaking events, and you were traveling and probably traveling the world and meeting with clients. And I know that some of that's gone now, but what are some of the other things that you may have changed to really embrace the last 15 to 18 months as that introvert?
Well, this is probably something that's not unique, and I share with so many people. What I have embraced, of course, is working in the digital space.
Yep.
And I remember going into all of this in March last year, when clients were cancelling suddenly all of the physical workshops. And I had such a mindset that I cannot do my work online. This deep work about transformation, leadership, disruption, top team development. It is impossible to do that online. And maybe I'll just have a vacation and see or do some writing, write another book. Or I've actually acquired a puppy dog as well in lockdown. So maybe I'll just devote myself to my new doggy. And what has really changed for me, I think, okay, yes, we've all moved to digital, but what I guess has changed for me is it taught me something about how my fixed views were actually inhibiting me from innovating. Why did it have to take a pandemic for me to be able to embrace, moving into different formats? So it was quite a humbling lesson for me, to be honest.
And has what's occurred and what you've experienced on a personal level over the last 15 to 18 months changed how you've approached the subject of the leadership of change? Because that is something you've focused on and researched and published on over many years. So have you found that you've now fundamentally started to review or see things through a different lens?
a good question. Has that changed in any way? Has change changed?
Yeah.
To be honest with you, I think what it has really underscored for me, I'm not sure whether it's changed anything, but what it has underscored is the fundamental importance of being in the moment and being totally self-aware in the moment, coming off of autopilot and being more intentional. And I do believe because of the disruption and moving again to an online world, I think people have had to be more intentional. Do I need this meeting? Do I not need this meeting? And I think in a way, all of the upsets, I mean, the first 2 or 3 months, oh my goodness, was I unsettled? My clients were unsettled. Suddenly Zoom meetings collapsed. Do I know what Miro boards mean? So it was a huge exercise in unsettlement and adaptation. And the only way to get through it was that we used all of the wobbles as data. So rather than complain about the technology or, gosh, the producer of the show didn't do it well enough, it was kind of like, okay, this is what it's like to lead in disruption. There will be little perturbations, as I call them. So in a way, it has amplified for me the importance of, you can choose right here, right now, how to respond to what happens. And I think we've been so disrupted by this move to digital that in a sense, I've had to learn not to complain, but to really become curious about what's happening around me. So I'm not sure it's changed what I think is important in change. I think it has just accentuated it, to be honest with you.
In some ways, it's the context has changed, doesn't it? I suppose the context that we're living in.
The context has changed, but interestingly, back in 1999, I read this book called Emergence by Stephen Johnson. He was a great media commentator, and he wrote this book that I think was way, in a sense, before its time. And the whole thing about emergence was this notion of constant unfolding of novelty. And, you will be surprised. We are not in control. We got to develop this humility. And I remember way back then, in the days when we were doing top-down leadership change programs, implementing big SAP and ERPs around the world. I mean, big restructurings. This notion of emergence back then, oh, Deb, don't be silly. We're in control of everything. We don't have to get used to things that suddenly arrive and we have to just work in an hour next way. We can't plan the next 6 months. We can only plan the next 4 weeks. So to an extent, I think it's almost like what I was predicting way back then has now caught up. And I'm extraordinarily busy now, to be honest, with requests for how do we now respond in this world. So in a way, practice has caught up with foresight.
It's amazing how we've all adapted and we've all had to learn over the last 15 to 18 months. You used a word that I want to kind of tap into, and you used the word curiosity. So let me go backwards to go forwards. Have you always been curious? Because obviously there's a real story that I know you tell us part and parcel of who you are and what drives you in relation to your adoption. So I want to link that. Have you always been curious into yourself in relation to your own self-awareness, and then that in some ways has led into the work that you do?
Always. So in my penultimate book, Still Moving, my opening sentence is, my life began in change.
Right.
And at 6 weeks old, I was taken away from my birth mother, and I was floating in a mother and baby's home for quite a few months before I was adopted. So what about disruption, out of control disruption? I lost all of the coordinates in my life that you should expect when you start that life. All the coordinates were thrown up in the air. And what it really taught me was the way to survive in that world is you've just got to start looking and start watching and start observing. And so I've always been insanely curious. My wonderful mum and dad, June and Ron Rowland, who adopted me. So from about the age of 3 or 4, I was always asking questions, and not just about my adoption story, but questions. I guess kids do ask questions, don't they? They're naturally curious. But I think for me, I was insanely curious. I think I was once described, and particularly curious about what? And my particular curiosity took me into the whole field of human systems and how they can be strengthened or how they can be adrenalized. And you mentioned the word anxiety. So in a way, the opposite of curiosity is anxiety.
Okay.
And I could easily flip between being curious and being very anxious. So that was, I learned a lesson out of being destabilized. I could switch between anxiety and curiosity very, very quickly.
Well, I want to come back to that kind of flipping between, you say, curiosity and anxiety. Are they two sides of the same fence? And I always say to people when I've chatted them, success leaves clues. And you talk about being insanely curious. I love that as a phrase. And I know you went on to Cambridge University and you did anthropology and archaeology. Now, is that more evidence of you being insanely curious in relation to your ability to now sense make or discover or explore or investigate? Are those more success clues?
Possibly. And I love the two subjects actually, because I think archaeology is like the study through time, longitudinal, and anthropology is more latitudinal. You're looking at the breadth of human behavior at any one time and being curious about the living world as such. And I think where the two intersected. And I love both those subjects, and particularly anthropology. It requires curiosity, it requires empathy, it requires the capacity to, as it's famously said, the task of anthropology is to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange.
Right, I like that.
So I love this thing about anthropologists said that you make this strange familiar. So when something strange comes your way, you're curious, what's that about? If I was in that habitat or if I had that social identity, would I think and feel and act in a similar way? So without judging things, one learns to have a bit of detachment from it and to stand with distance and to be curious as to how can I understand this in that particular context. So you have more lateral vision, I believe, as an anthropologist rather than tunnel vision.
And that's so important, isn't it? I had Nick Jankel on the show a number of months ago, who's a futurist, and he was talking about transformational leadership and said that leaders have got to try and get the balance between being inside out and outside in. And obviously the outside in, he was referring to their ability to sense make, to try and change noise into signal so that they can start to understand the chaos that is around us. And so do you find yourself doing more and more work now with leaders in relation to the importance of sense making, to opening themselves up, to just trying to see, hear and feel what's going on around them in order to try and make sense of it?
Absolutely.
And what are some
because
of the biggest...
when we're in uncertainty.
Yeah. Go on, Deborah. When we're in uncertainty, we need a narrative. Our interpretive capacities are triggered. We need to have some interpretation of seeming randomness. So that's clearly, in the last 18 months, this is, what's happened has given us a chance to cultivate that particular capacity. Sorry, Adam. That's all right. I lost the signal ever so slightly there. That's why I jumped in, but it was slightly intermittent, but that's fine. I can hear you now.
So I love going back to sense making. And there's an incredible guy called Carl Weick. Some of your listeners might know of Carl Weick. I think he's still around, W-E-I-C-K. And he's written so many books. I think he was based out in Columbia or Michigan on sense making in organizations. But he has 4 properties of when there's high ambiguity, high uncertainty, when the amygdala in the brain are flaring up and everybody's getting very, very anxious. How can leaders somehow bring attention to the sense-making properties? And the 4 things he writes about, the first one, interestingly, is attention. Going back to curiosity. So you just got to start noticing stuff, right? So if you have dampened attention capacities, attention is all about being alert, spotting things, noticing things, reading things. So that's the quality of information flow, for example, the quality of feedback loops and data. How quickly does data get out in the system? So how can you raise the attention levels? Like, for example, in the pandemic, how our government had, weekly or daily briefings at 5 o'clock, right? That was attention. We all turned it, right? What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? The second thing he writes about, which I love, is animation. Just start doing something. I love animation. Because if you just sit in your armchair when the world is, just start doing something. I guess it's a bit like prototyping, or just go out and keep walking and see what you find.
Okay.
And he tells this wonderful story of a true story of Hungarian soldiers who got lost in the Alps. And they came back down to base camp. They were given up for lost. All the search parties went out. And they came back, semi-frozen back into base camp after 2 nights, I think, out on the Alps. And somebody asked her, how did you survive? How did you get off the mountain? And so, we had a map. Anyway, they opened the map and it was the Pyrenees, not the Alps.
I know, it's a great story, isn't it? Completely the wrong map,
so the
but it
thing
allowed
is,
them.
it's the wrong map, but maps get you going. Maps, oh, right, here's the map. Right, now let's look around, so you just got to, so his theory about changes, any odd theory will do, just have one because it gets people going, gets people moving. The third thing is interaction, the quality of interaction.
Okay.
So have we got good spaces where we can have a good natter about things, right? In a way where we can be vulnerable, we can take risks, we can say if we're not, really not feeling great. So, what can leaders do in high ambiguity to have dialogue? I loved it during the economic crisis in South London. In the pubs, they had stitch and bitch sessions.
Stitch and bitch. Okay, you've got to tell me about that, Deborah.
So it was based on in New England, back in 150 years ago when they were sewing the quilts. So,
right.
You'd get together at night and you would all be helping to, get the quilt, and you'd all have a really good, Barney about what's going on right now and all of the things you're anxious about or worried about. Anyway, in these South London pubs, they thought, well, it's pretty, difficult right now with the economic crisis. So they had literally, you could see them on boards, stitch and bitch. But it was all about come along and have a good cathartic conversation with people.
Venting.
Leaders don't give enough space, I think, in ambiguity for people to have that kind of freedom, to have so interaction, dial up the interaction.
Okay.
And the fourth one is direction. So even though if you don't know the destination, have a direction, a loose intention as to, what's really important right now. We might not know how to get there, but we need an intention. So intention, attention, animation, and direction. They're the four things that leaders can work with when they're trying to help people make sense of ambiguity. Anyway, long answer to your original question. I'm finding now in my work with leaders, with the change models I use, that's still moving, tuning into the system, handling uncertainty. I'm now going back to the White principles I learned back in the 1980s, and leaders love them right now. Okay. They have these four things. What can I do to dial up these four things right now in an environment when I don't always have the answers?
It gives people that map, doesn't it, Deborah? It gives people maybe the inertia for them to feel confident to just do something, take action, take a step forward. But that takes me to the subject of this episode, and that's the being before doing. So when we talk about going out, also incredibly important, and thank you for that wonderful answer. You and I spoke a couple of months ago in relation to that inward debate. And I asked you just before we started recording, have you also experienced leaders at all levels starting to ask themselves and help their team deal with fundamental questions that are inward? Am I happy? What is my value proposition? What do I want to do going forward? Do I want to commute? Do I want to live where we're living? How do I want to reframe the relationship with my family, my children? Are you finding that as well, that people are now looking quite deeply inwards?
Unquestionably. And in your introduction, I think the word pause was mentioned. How when a computer pauses, or I can't remember exactly what the sentence was.
When you press the pause button on a computer, it stops. But on a human, that's when we start to think.
Absolutely. And in fact, I was doing a talk in the days when I was flying around the world doing speeches about this notion of being before doing, which is a phrase that we've coined at Still Moving, about hitting the importance of hitting the pause button to turn inward. But somebody came up to me at the end and she said, it's the 3 Ps. I said, what do you mean by the 3 Ps? And she said, pause permits perspective. I love that.
I love that.
Pause permits perspective. So if you don't pause, you can't widen your frame of sense making, or, so the whole thing about you notice more things when you slow down. You notice more things when you slow down. And we've all been forced to slow down, to stop, to pause, to have, what do we do with the 2 hours commute that I used to do? I've had loads of leaders say, well, I used to have all of this commuting time. I don't have it anymore. So when I get up at 7 and I'm sitting at my desk at 7:30, I think, right, what do I do now? And what we found in our research, and that's why Still Moving is Still Moving, is that in order to truly get to a different place, i.e. movement, you first need to become still and to turn inward and particularly to notice your inner response to experience. So all of our research, 52% of the reason why big change either succeeds or fails pivots. We have this change vitality cone like a spinning top. It all pivots on the capacity to stay present and to notice what's here inside you right now. Because
so
that is the only thing you can change. You are in control of your inner response to what's happening. That is, the Viktor Frankl, there is space and freedom to choose one's response. You can't always choose experience. You can choose your response to experience. And the fascinating thing in the research is that when leaders can not just tune into, but also regulate their response. This is the anxious or curious response to what happens in life. They can then tune into and regulate the world outside them. But it starts with turning inward. And I often tell the story when I was people director at BBC Worldwide of how I was having to host a risk committee. I was managing a big relocation. And I was really projecting onto the risk committee thinking, oh, this is boring. All of these people aren't really being creative enough. And people from audit telling me what not to do and what I can do. And I was more creative and transformational. And I got up one morning and I went in thinking, do you know what? I'm going to change my inner response in this meeting. Same people, same agenda, same risk matrix. We were always in the Doctor Who room at Broadcasting House.
That sounds pretty cool.
It's pretty cool, the Dalek in the corner. And I had switched my inner response. Now, I remember my preparation for that meeting was not reading all of the wad of PowerPoint slides and whatever. I just went into a mode of curiosity, compassion, respect, kindness, and openness, as opposed to judgment, cynical, oh, I wish I wasn't in this meeting. And do you know what, Adam? It was one of the best meetings we ever had. And all I had shifted was my inner response to chairing a risk committee. I didn't change the people or the process or the meeting room. I changed my presence was felt, and my presence was felt in a different way.
You see, Deborah, this really resonates with me because, I'm passionate about human-centered leadership, and I've been working on the 7 components, and you're mentioning a number of them, whether it's personal purpose, vigilance, curiosity, empathy, inclusivity. And here's a question for you. Are you finding that leaders that you're working with find it difficult, challenging, even intimidating to stop and reflect in the moment like that? Because we're busy. Before the pandemic, we were always so busy, too busy for anything. But now, is there a hesitation in senior leaders to really stop and ask themselves different questions and experience things differently, and in some ways, take the mask off a little bit? Are you finding that at all?
I am. The phrase I love to use is it's we're less defended. We've had become more undefended in a way, and more open and more vulnerable, and less, the mask as you're naming it as well. So, but it's really hard to do. I was working with an executive team last week on, 2 of what we call our inner capacities of staying present and being curious to what arises.
Right.
Even the difficult stuff, it might be that you're having violent feelings towards that person, in your executive team. Do you sit on that, or do you say anything about that? Because when you stop to notice what's really going on, all kinds of things might get stirred up. That's why we don't do it. We might be scared or anxious about really turning in, just not just seeing what's there, but then to name what's there. Are you then brave enough to name to others what's really going on inside you? And we did this exercise, and the fascinating thing was most people, their default is to provide commentary about what other people are saying.
Right. Summarizing, editorializing? Do you mean
summarizing? Yes, or justifying their views, or going into long explanations. So the activity was very simply they went into pairs in breakout rooms.
Right.
And one person was going to talk about, very simple, how am I right now? That's all they went, how am I right now? Right now. And the other person was going to listen and then just say, how was I when I was listening to how you are right now?
Okay.
It sounds simple, okay? They found it extraordinarily difficult to do, because the primary response was, oh, so you're feeling like that? Well, maybe when you do the next meeting, how about you do it like that, right? So they were always commenting on the other person, as opposed to, do you know, when you were saying that, my stomach really turned over, or
Right.
my heart started to really pump when you talked about how you were, or do you know what, I feel shame that you've just shared that and I didn't know. So they all got back to debrief, and they said they all went into the breakout thinking, oh, this is so easy what Deborah's asking us to do.
Yeah.
But they were not responding from what was going on inside them. They were commenting on the situation outside of them rather than truly tuning into what was going on inside of them. And what do you lose if you can't do that? As I said, you lose this whole capacity, because if you can't tune into what's going on inside you, you can't tune into it's going back to inside out. For me, I believe inside out starts before outside in.
I think I'm with you, and that's fascinating, isn't it? Because aren't so many leaders, they're always problem solving or trying to, or they have an action bias. So therefore they're already trying to solve somebody else's problem or take action in relation to, as opposed to, as you say, stop, reflect. How is this manifesting itself internally? That's a much more difficult conversation for so many people, isn't it?
It is. And unless you do that, though, you can't really uncover what is our unconscious bias here, or
Right.
you can't change your perception skills, because you'll always see things in exactly the same way.
So where's this coming from for you? Because you're passionate about this, and you've dedicated many years of your life to this, and you continue to, but where's this coming from for you? What's driving you in relation to this focus on the inward and your ability to help so many other people, and some very experienced and senior people start to look at things very, very differently, as you say, starting from the inside out, not the other way around?
Well, for me, I can only speak for myself, really.
Sure.
Is I have found it's like a port in the storm. I maybe an introvert, I would say this, but I find my inner life is my harbour. It's where it's a point of safety. It's something that really, and I know that in our prep talks as well, we talked a bit about my faith, and how my faith anchors me as well. We don't have to go into that in any detail on this podcast, or we might want to do, God, I don't know. But it's not just faith. Most traditions know that by turning inward, the equilibrium that you can find there, that enables you to be a much calmer resource and a more perceptive resource to the world outside you.
And we talked, didn't we, about spirituality, and I'm no expert at all, but when we talk about spirituality, help me understand that from maybe a leadership perspective. Is that an ability to find calm in the storm, to actually look inwardly, to actually reflect deeply on how we're feeling, what's motivating us, what's sustaining us? I don't know, what's energizing us. Is that true in relation to just that, trying to embrace our own spirituality?
Yes, well, I do believe that it's not a completely selfish act to turn inward. And it's not just my faith, but I do believe that when we turn inward, we're also connecting to the world. So, and of course, with faith, one does believe that that's where you find God, when you turn inwards. But also when leaders turn inward, because leaders in senior positions have so much projection of the system onto them, that when you turn inward, the resource is not just about you and your story. Did I have a good sleep last night or not? Am I feeling grouchy or whatever?
Yeah.
Because whatever data is inside you is probably a systemic signal. It's not just about you. So I believe that you can contact much higher realms of knowing when you turn inward. Now, for me, the ultimate level of knowing is the divine knowing.
Right.
For a leader in an organizational system, you can contact the knowingness of the culture or the climate around you by turning inward. So you don't just turn inward to know about, oneself. You turn inward to know about, the fractal, that your inner world is like a fractal of the system around you.
And again, this really resonates, because so many leaders are hopefully positive role models. They drive or imbue the culture, and the culture is sometimes pervasive, and that can be a positive culture or not so positive culture. So that's incredibly important, isn't it? Because when, I suppose, organizations talk about values, people have got to understand what are the behaviors that support and undermine those values on a day-to-day basis. So in some ways, the leaders and the leadership have really got to understand how that manifests itself day-to-day behaviors. How are they seen? How are they heard? What are people taking away from how they behave on a day-to-day basis through a crisis? Which, is that a fair comment?
Absolutely. And I always believe that the most inexpensive form of doing a culture survey, rather than doing a massive survey and
Right.
focus groups out around the organization, is just take a cross section of different leadership teams across the system and just do what we call a tuning into oneself. What's here in this team? Is it boredom? Is it excitement? Is it energy? Is it envy? Whatever it might be, because that is systemic data. It's not just data about the individual. So I think that's quite an inexpensive way of doing a culture survey is by looking at the what's going on for you personally.
I think that's a great bit of advice. And on that basis, Deborah, what are some of the things that you might suggest for leaders to look for or even be aware of as we start to slowly move our way out of a global pandemic? What are some of the things that you think that people should be aware of over the horizon, or even perhaps sooner than that? Maybe I'm explaining that wrong, but some of the things that you feel that leaders should be aware of and more mindful of going forward.
That's lots of potential answers to that.
That's an unfair point, I know, but what's front of mind for you?
I think one of the things is what's our agenda now?
Okay.
And what can slip away?
Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yes, well, I think, great change leaders, we talked about the being bit, but one of the key aspects of what you do to lead change well is to be quite ruthless and just focus on the big things that count and not get distracted in lots of, interesting ideas or whatever, but aren't really, really central. And I think that what's coming on the horizon now is that what's important in terms of what work we take on and what work we don't take on has really come under the magnifying glass. So I think there's something here about, well, two things really. One is maybe three things, who knows where this is going, but no, number one is, what is our work? What's essential? The second thing is, I think it's something about who are we serving? I think the last 15 months has really drawn to attention to, we are all interdependent in some way. And what we do can either harm life or the planet or what we're doing, or it can actually enhance it. Right. So I also think that leaders are thinking a bit more about not just what we do, but who we serve and how we serve, and also how we value different forms of work. This whole notion of essential workers in like the caregivers, and so I think it's also turned on its head really how we value what kinds of roles to keep society ticking along. So it's partly about our agenda, it's partly about who we're serving, and I think it's also about just being more aware that we all respond differently. And I think having flexibility and giving people greater choice in a way for how they work, where they work, also feels important at the moment. But I think there's going to be some tough choices. I think some of my clients are saying, well, if we do really focus on what's essential and who we're serving, do we need everything that we've done in the past? So there might be a bit of a slimming down, or I don't know. I haven't got a crystal ball here.
No, but I love what you're saying, because it really resonates. Again, I've had a couple of guests. I had a doctor who is working in India, and she said, listen, we were all experiencing this storm of COVID, but you have to understand, she said, we're in very, very different boats. And I think very, very apt phrase. And also there was a neurologist I spoke to too, who talked about the power of simplicity, and we're going to have to make some decisions now to just drop things, to just leave things out or stop doing things that perhaps we just instinctively and automatically did without thinking, because we were just, I don't know, that automaton pre-COVID. So I think this really resonates, and you're right. There are a lot of different things that leaders are going to have to think about, challenge themselves with, and pivot. I've got a question for you. Is there something that you have done differently over the last 15 to 18 months that you're going to continue doing, Deborah, as we head out of COVID and into whatever we head into? But is there something that sticks out for you that you changed, you started to do or think differently over the last 15 to 18 months, but you're going to embrace it and run with it?
Well, certainly at the practical level, there is the traveling less.
Yeah.
That certainly is something I'm going to embrace moving forward. That's obviously the main thing that I have done differently.
Yeah, I bet. Although on a personal
I need
level,
to pause at the moment in this podcast. What else have I changed? I mean, that's been the main thing.
Yeah, no. I say I edit this, so it's just.
I know. I'm just trying to think out loud now.
No, you can do. That's the beauty of this. You can think out loud,
Yeah.
and all of that. The power is in the edit. But I think it's been a really reflective time. It has been for me as well. There's been some challenges. So I mean, I lost my mum at the start of the pandemic last year, and this hasn't been easy on my teenagers for reasons I won't bore you with. So in some ways, I'm going through a process of fundamentally asking myself different questions in relation to what it was and how I want to do things going forward. I mean, Deborah, I was on a plane every single week before the pandemic, and I thought that was normal. And now I realize that was about as far from normal as possible. And my kids used to joke that Dad was always on an aeroplane. And I used to think, oh, that's so funny. That's bonkers. What was I thinking? Or I just wasn't thinking. So I'm with you on some of those fronts, but I just wonder if there's if there's anything that stood out for you that.
That's the main thing is traveling less. I can't think of anything.
It gives you that connection with the people that I think are most important to you. I think of all the hours spent in the air, in the car, on the train, whatever it might be. It's a bit bonkers. Okay, well, let me ask you this, because I love some of the things. I love some of the things that we've spoken about, and it'll be great as I patch it together. But how can people get in contact with you if they want to know more, if they want to continue the debate, or even get you in to help them in relation to this aspect of change and leading through change? How do they get hold of you?
Well, you could visit our website.
Okay.
It's not just me. There's a great team that I work with, and that's still-moving.com. I would love people to maybe pick up my book. I think reading my book is a great access into what is this woman about and her ideas and
Tell us about
how
the
she
book.
might help. So Still Moving, How to Lead Mindful Change, published by Wiley in 2017. So I was really, in fact, I wrote this book at this very desk, I'm sitting.
Okay. It all happened there.
Here. It all happened here. And because I love writing in isolating places like Cornwall, but it's a book that I feel really has touched a lot of people and has given my work access to so many people in the world that I wouldn't have had through my own personal network. It has really got out there and moved and inspired a lot of people. So that's also a suggestion there as well. Obviously, definitely. On LinkedIn, you can check me out on LinkedIn as well. We run a lot of programs, public programs for how to get involved with Still Moving and our leading change frameworks as well.
Okay.
Running some public programs through the IMI, the Irish Management Institute, that kicks off in November. It'll all be online, so you can join that from wherever you are in the world as well. And I'm Deborah at stillmoving.com if you're wanting to get in contact with me through email.
Good. I'm glad you've given us all those details. So if I can ask all the listeners, please do check Deborah's website out and also get the book. And here's my final question, and I call it the insight. And my question is, what's the most powerful piece of leadership advice that you've received or given? What's front of mind for you?
Yes, I think this goes back a bit to your inner core and feeling stable and secure. I think when one feels stable and secure, you can do anything. You can take any risk. I always remember somebody once saying to me, because I was pretty fearless and curious, but I was in a bit of a, eek, should I do this or not? And this very wise person once said to me, Deborah, no one falls off the universe.
I quite love that.
And I just thought, no one falls off the universe. So I've never forgotten that sentence. No one falls off the universe.
It'd be great. Just in case we've got any flat earthers listening as well, they may have a different view of that.
It's a bit like that question, which I love, a question I love, which is, if you knew you couldn't fail, what would you do?
I think that's a great question, isn't it?
Isn't it an amazing question?
And people come up with answers which have got nothing to do with normally what they're doing at the moment in their life. And I always ponder with that and think, have we all missed a trick, or did we just lack the courage a while ago to kind of have that screw it, just do it attitude? I don't know.
Well, I fully trust that whatever happens is what's meant to happen. Maybe that comes from my faith or whatever, I don't know. But I am fully trusting that whatever I do and whatever the impact will be, whatever people might say or think about me, in some way that relates to my purpose and what I'm trying to do. So that makes you pretty fearless when you can sort of just go through life with that solid, secure belief.
Well, Deborah, whether you meant it or not, you've just given me another wonderful insight there as part of this episode. So I got two wonderful insights there at the end of this episode. So thank you very much indeed. Listen, it's been great having you as a guest on the Leadership Enigma. Thank you so much. Please stay safe in that wonderful location that you are. And I know you're heading back to London soon. So I hope that we will, I'll be able to have a coffee with you at some point and actually say hi and thank you in person. But thanks so much for joining the show.
Thank you for having me.
Join us again next week for more tips and strategies on the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with your host on LinkedIn or visit the dedicated website, www.leadersenigma.com, powered by Transform Performance International, where you can access our exclusive learning, including books, videos, bonus content, assessments, and more. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.